This presentation is something that is, if you want, just a start for a conversation. And what I'm presenting to you now, I'm hoping, within the next few months, 2 or 3 months, for it to become this first presentation to be part of a docu-series. So we want to put together a professionally done docu-series that is meant to reach out to people, as you said, who are searching, who have questions, or who are on the fence, and to be if you want, a conversation starter, an open door. Because sometimes there are people who are not prepared for a Bible study, but they entertain the idea of the possibility of a God, but the existence of God, but they have a problem, maybe some of them, with the concept and the idea of God that's been presented to them. And they want to explore it, but they don't really know exactly where to start. And this evening's presentation, I think the title is very courageous and very gutsy, but I think the title is the umbrella. Because let me share the screen and go straight into the presentation. Because what I would like us to actually talk about, and this will be the title of the docu-series, is going to be the burden of proof. Beyond the burden of proof. And tonight I would like us to speak about the burden of faith. Very often speaking about faith, entertaining the idea of believing in a supreme being, in someone who is beyond our reality, someone who is greater than us, and someone who taps into realities beyond the here and now, to some people seems to be an absurd idea, and sometimes people may feel a little bit uncomfortable even to talk about it or to open up about it. I remember having a conversation with someone, and he asked me, "Are you a believer?" But the way he said believer was very kind of like, really, you're still into this kind of stuff? And I'd like us to explore this aspect, because I think this is the starting point in any conversation about God. Is there a God? I think this is a very personal question. It is it has very subjective answers, but I think that there are certain definites that we can talk about, and that's what I would like us to explore today. You see, we could ask ourselves what shapes our convictions. And I think that, living in England or in Ireland, it's become evident that the religious paradigm is not authoritative anymore, and it's not the paradigm that is embraced by the majority. This is the reality. I grew up in a country, I originally come from Romania. I grew up in a country at a time when, even though we were under communism, faith was still taken for granted, so to speak. People would go to church. The belief in God was something that, if you would ask someone on the street, "Do you believe in God?" they would look at you funny. "What do you mean?" "Of course I believe in God." Or if you were to ask them, "Is there a God?" But now things have changed. And I think that as church people, we need to be aware of that. And I think that we need to acknowledge that. And not just that that reality changed. We live in a very pluralistic society where traditions, if you want, are outdated. We live in the era of globalization and the internet, when there is access to information instantly. There are so many things that people can explore, so many questions they can answer, and so many answers to be found. So I think that when it comes to the whole idea of whether religion is still viable, relevant, marketable, true, these are very, very important questions. But it all goes down, it all comes down to what we believe. And I'm going to start with quoting a well-known new atheist, if you want, Sam Harris. And what I'm going to do here tonight is also I'm going to present quite a number of resources. And some of the books that I'm going to present to you, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to read, but we need to be aware of what's been shaping the thinking around this topic. So even Sam Harris says that when it comes to our beliefs, our beliefs define our vision of the world. They are very important because they dictate our behavior, they determine our emotional response to other human beings. So is it important to talk about faith? Yes, it is, for our own sanity, because we face questions daily, and for the well-being of our neighbor. What we believe could affect our neighbor as well, the way we interact with people, and not just the way we interact with individuals, but the way we contribute to the society at large. Let me just define a few terms here, and you see what we think, or our beliefs to a certain extent, form what we would call the worldview. And we've studied this a lot in our class, but what I found really relevant to this is that when it comes to what a worldview is, a way of thinking, this is it's supposed to answer to the full fundamentals, or to offer answers to the full fundamental questions of origin, meaning, morality, and hope. If we were to try and be as comprehensive as possible, probably would also add purpose. Meaning and purpose go hand in hand, some would say. So I think it is really important. And I think it's it's crucial for us to understand that when it comes to our own formation as spiritual beings, but also when it comes to people we interact with on a daily basis, everyone is concerned, whether they admit it or not, with questions regarding origin, meaning, morality, and hope. And as we attempt to offer answers to these questions to ourselves, these answers need to be rational. They need to make sense. They need to be correspondently true. What do I mean by that? What I believe about death needs to be rationally and in harmony with what I believe about life. And also they need to be coherent. And this is the reason I think that probably this is one of the main issues that cause a lot of confusion when it comes to presenting the faith paradigm to someone. Because to many people, some of the ideas that Christianity, for example, some of the answers that Christianity seems to offer, they tend to be seen as obsolete, as unnecessary. There's another presentation I have on morality, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with Richard Holloway. He was a leader of the Episcopalian Church in Scotland, and after retiring, he wrote a number of books, and one of the books he wrote is entitled Godless Morality, Taking God Out of Ethics. And there he speaks about the fact that the concept and notion of sin, for example, is obsolete. We shouldn't be talking about sin these days. In today's reality, sin is an archaic concept which we need to leave behind. So just to close this parenthesis, if you want, so if you take sin out of the picture, then there is no need for a savior. And the whole Christian foundational paradigm of the need for a savior collapses. And if you add to that, that yes, I can be an ethical person without being a believer, the whole question of the necessity of the Christian paradigm, Christian teaching on morality falls, collapses, right? So it needs to be coherent and it needs to be correspondently true. If all these answers do not make sense, or let me give another example. Okay, we could say, look, it's important to believe in God because God is the ultimate point of reference when it comes to morality. He's the only absolute. Okay, I accept it. Okay, you know what? Even when it comes to hope, the Christian narrative speaks about the hereafter, all right? A world without pain, without death, without illness. Okay, that's the ultimate of what hope is all about. But then we come to origins. And all of a sudden, we are told that, for example, Genesis 1 through to 3, they are just a myth. And we need to accept, if we want to be, rational thinking beings, then we need to embrace and accept the theory of evolution. All of a sudden, you have coherence goes out the window, because you have answers that are somehow rooted into the Christian narrative, but then you have answers that step outside of it, and you cannot accept it as a whole. So this is just by means of an introduction. What informs us today? And you know what? I think that there's so much. I don't know how many of you watch Netflix. I'm not saying that advocating that you should be watching Netflix, but there's a very, very interesting documentary entitled The Social Dilemma on Netflix. If you have Netflix, watch it, because it speaks about how social media is influencing our way of thinking today. It's brilliant. It's something worth watching. And the question would be, what informs and educates us today? And there are different things. You've got popular specialty books. I'm going to come back to that. You've got entertainment. You've got TV programs. You've got social media. There's so much stuff that we consume. And let me also maybe say this as well. You see, Pastor Trevor, it's much easier to do this when this is not your church. You can just say some stuff. As Christians, we have self-control. We have certain things that we put into place to control the intake of information. For example, most Christians don't watch movies. They don't read just any books. They're more careful. And even when it comes to educating our children, we say, you shouldn't watch this, you shouldn't do that. But I think that we have to be very conscious. If we are a forward-thinking church, trying to reach out to those who do not necessarily think the way we think, we need to acknowledge that people are informed and educated. Their thinking is formed by means very different than our own. Sometimes when people come to visit, they are curious to see what kind of books are in my library. And there are some very weird books in my library. There is one entitled How to Be a Good Atheist, for example. And I say, what's going on? And I tell them, I think it's very important, especially for me as a pastor, to know how people think, not just inside my church, but even people who are not interested in things religious, because I want to be able to reach them. And then if we were to speak of our children who go to school, even primary school, secondary school, university, especially university age, they are exposed to ideas and ideologies very different from what we teach them in the home or at church. And again, those ideas begin to sound dissonant within their own minds. And this is the reason why a number of young people, or maybe too many young people, leave the church, because they cannot bring together that which they've been taught as children and that which they are being taught in school. So I'm going to just give you a few examples of some books that have really made an impact on the way people think today when it comes to faith. I'm sure many of you have heard of Richard Dawkins. 2006, he published this book, The God Delusion, and this is when my interest in this topic was sparked. At the time, I was the pastor amongst other churches of a district in Cape Town in South Africa, and this particular church was made up of hundreds of young people. At one time, we had 14 university lecturers attending. And postgraduate students, and when this book came out, they came to me and they said, Pastor Dan, do we have an answer to this? And I realized that, you know what, we don't really. And I began to study on this topic. And another book that's made a huge impact was the one written by Sam Harris, The End of Faith, Religion, Terror, and the Future of Reason. And then I'm just going to mention the third one. And again, this is a book that sometimes when people come to my home and they look in the library and they see God is Not Great, it's Pastor, then what are you reading? It was written by Christopher Hitchens. He's passed away in the meantime, but these three individuals, and there are others, they formed the elite of new atheism, and they've rocked the Christian and the faith paradigm. Now, what's really interesting is that a number of people have tried to respond, and I'm going to give you a few examples. Here we have the Dawkins delusion, and this is written by Alistair McGrath and Joanna Collicutt McGrath, his wife. And Alistair is an apologetics professor, and he did very well, but probably an even better response to Richard Dawkins's book was The Devil's Delusion by David Berlinski. And David Berlinski is actually a non-believer. He's a Jew, an agnostic Jew, but he really took this book to pieces. The Devil's Delusion, Atheism, and its scientific pretensions. And it really looks at, you know, does science have all the answers, or does it just explain the how without necessarily answering the why? In response to The End of Faith, Sam Harris's book, we have Rabbi Zacharias. Again, unfortunately, he passed away recently. A brilliant apologist, and he wrote this book, The End of Reason, which I personally have a problem with, and you'll see why. I think the title itself is unfortunate, but the book is just brilliant. And on The God is Not Great, I don't know how many of you have actually listened to Louis Giglio's presentations on how great is our God. He has this presentation where he looks at this golf ball and he says, you see, this is our earth. And then he looks at how great the universe is and how great God must be if he created this amazing universe. So this is just to have an idea of what's been happening and what's out there and what's kind of like sparked this whole conversation. And I'm just trying to keep up with this myself. Then, what else informs and educates people? We talk about media, we talk about Netflix, but there are so many other things, and I'm just gonna show you a few. There's truly an amazing interest in series that you know they take scientific information and they try to relate in a way that people can really understand it. One of these docuseries is entitled Through the Wormhole with Morgan Freeman. I think if I'm not wrong, even in the first episode, he speaks about, he poses the question of, is there a God? Interestingly enough, the same actor is at the center of another docuseries, The Story of God. I don't know if you've watched that. No. Then we've got Cosmo, A Space-Time Odyssey, and this is just a remake or a continuation of Carl Sagan's The Cosmo Odyssey. This was in 1980s that it was produced. A docuseries that's really I found it extremely interesting. It's called Year Million, and again, you can find this. I think it's on the National Geographic platforms, and even Disney Plus. They have a National Geographic section, and you can watch it there. And they look at what the future is going to look like. God has no place in it. It is what Yuval Harari speaks about, us becoming, or humanity becoming God in the near future. You know, a merge of humans and machines. And then another one strange rock, and this is narrated by Will Smith, and again another actor, and this is a conversation with a number of people who've been in space, and they just look at how wonderful and how beautiful this strange rock called Earth is, but it educates and informs people while keeping the God story out of the picture completely. All right, so people are enthralled, they are excited, they are educated about the world that we live in, about the future, about the past, even the story of God from a cultural perspective. And but you know, the traditional Christian ideas of a creator God, of a God who is in control, and who is in control of the past, the present, and the future, is obliterated without people saying they're doing that. And we need to be mindful of that. We need to be aware of that. All right, so let's move on. When it comes to faith, Richard Dawkins says, so because this is what I'd like us to focus on, and Pastor Trevor, I know we've got, I've got just probably another 20 minutes that I can cover. Now, he's very outspoken, and speaking about faith, he says faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. So in other words, he says, you know what? If you still believe in God, you are stupid. I'm sorry to put it bluntly like that, but you are not thinking. You are not looking at the evidence. And even to think about faith is something that you should just completely forget about. Now, while he is saying that, Christopher Hitchens, kind of like exasperatedly, you know, he just says, yeah, okay, true, but religion, truthfully, is ineradicable. We can't get rid of it. Whether we want to or not, religion is something that we cannot get rid of. And Sam Harris comes in again, he interjects, and he brings into question whether faith is rational or not. Religious faith represents so uncompromising a misuse of the power of our minds that it forms a kind of perverse cultural singularity. Cultural singularity means that you can't really talk to people who think that way. Actually, he says a vanishing point beyond which rational discourse proves impossible. So, in other words, he says people of faith are people you can't talk to, you can't reason with, because faith is irrational. So let's ask, I'm going to ask three main questions tonight on this issue, faith. First of all, is faith rational? Now, I saw this this sign on you know, in a church, and I would like, you know, we can't really converse, but I was really disturbed by it. Reason is the greatest enemy that faith has. I think that some people misunderstand what reason stands for, what it means. And that I believe that we have been gifted reason by God himself to make sense, to think, to make sense of things. And that's why I said, I think it was a little bit unfortunate that Rabbi Zacharias spoke, you know, entitled his book, The End of Reason, but he was trying to respond to Sam Harris, and I think it was just a matter of, you know, let's dialogue on this, because the book is absolutely brilliant. I would recommend it. Now, just to give a little bit of history, if you want, the enmity between reason and faith began with Thomas Aquinas' theology, in which he argued that though man fell in Eden, his intellect did not. All right? This view created a system of philosophy that argued that man's reason was autonomous, meaning free and independent of any constraint. This further opened the door for later philosophers building philosophic arguments independent of the idea of God. I'd like to suggest to you that mainstream Christianity consistently emphasizes that faith and reason go together. Mr. Trevor was talking about, people who may want to have Bible studies. And I think that when it comes to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, oh man, we have the most rational Bible studies you could ever get. You've got history, people really think. We help people think. And then when we take the scriptures, we say, okay, let's look at this verse. What does this verse say? Is it in harmony with what the scripture says? Reason affirms faith, if you want. Biblical faith, so mainstream Christianity, and I'd like to think the Seventh-day Adventist Church also, we say that biblical faith is trust in God because he has shown himself to be reliable and trustworthy. Christian apologetics claims that faith is not belief in spite of the evidence, but belief in light of the evidence. And friends, when it comes to evidence, Richard Dawkins talks about evidence. What evidence are we talking about? So now we're just staying within the realm of what we are talking about, and that is whether the Christian faith, Christian paradigm makes sense. Now, even Mahatma Gandhi once said that faith must be enforced by reason. When faith becomes blind, it dies. Right? So I think this is a very interesting understanding. Okay. Now, the truth is that there's another interesting book that I'd like to recommend. And by the way, you don't have to read all of them, as I said, but this is just, if we want to be informed, these are good books to read. John Humphreys considers himself to be an agnostic, however, somehow quoting the idea of faith. And he wrote this book, In God We Doubt, Confessions of a Failed Atheist. And he says, most of us want our belief to be confirmed rather than proven false, and will disregard any inconvenient evidence. So when we speak about evidence, evidence is probably one of the most relative terms we can talk about. Again, part of this series is going to be 2 talks on origins. And we are going to engage, I'm going to engage the theory of evolution in a different way. You see, until now, Christianity has been questioned. I'm going to turn the tables on the theory of evolution and ask some uncomfortable questions because it doesn't necessarily have all the answers. I apologize for the noise. I have a printing machine which has a life of its own. It switches on its own. It's quite weird. And then it just starts doing stuff. I don't think it's printing anything, though. All right. Question number 2. We need to go through this as quickly as we can. Is faith a gift? Okay. So let me try and see if I can do this. And please tell me if you can hear. I'd like to play a clip from a movie, but let's see.
Okay.
I don't know.
Your screen has frozen at the moment. It looks like the PowerPoint is trying to pull away to one side. That's what.
Okay. Let's. Okay. Let's do this.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll try to share the screen again. And it may not be. It's just a very, very short clip anyway. So if it doesn't work, again, I apologize. I do not mean to offend anybody. This is a clip from a movie called Angels and Demons. Have you heard of it? Dan Brown. And it goes in line with the idea of what people are being educated by. So I'm just going to play the clip and I'll leave it at this. What's important is the sound.
Christianity's most sacred codices are in that archive. Given your recent entanglement with the church, there is a question I'd like to ask you first here.
Yeah, you have to share the screen, Dan.
All right. Let me share the screen. All right, so this is a conversation between the main character, a professor in symbols, and then he's having a conversation with the papal aide, and the papal aide is gonna ask him some a very pertinent question. So let me see.
Christianity's most sacred codices are in that archive. Given your recent entanglement with the church, there is a question I'd like to ask you first here in the office of His Holiness. Do you believe in God, sir?
Father, I simply believe that religion...
I did not ask if you believe what man says about God. I asked if you believe in God.
I'm an academic. My mind tells me I will never understand God.
And your heart?
Tells me I'm not meant to. Faith is a gift that I have yet to receive.
All right. So let me share my screen again. Did you hear what he said? Faith is a gift. I'm still to receive. Okay. All right. Now, I found that very interesting, because I'm saying it again. You know, we educate ourselves, we inform ourselves by reading books that we're very, very careful in choosing what kind of books we read. Hopefully, we read the Bible every day. Hopefully, we communicate with God on a daily basis. Our spiritual faith formation is something that we prioritize. Many people don't. Many people don't. They don't see the reason for it. They don't. Their spiritual need is met in different ways, and they don't necessarily feel the need to go to church or to read the Bible or anything like that. And without knowing it, social media, watching movies, reading different books, listening, even casual conversations is what forms their thinking and what educates them. And you just go to the movies to watch a movie, or very innocently, you know, read some of Dan Brown's books. I mean, he started with the Da Vinci Code. That's really shook the foundations of many things that were given for many people. And you just listen. Oh yeah, no, listen. Yeah, this guy says, you know, he doesn't have the gift. I mean, maybe I don't have the gift. Faith is a gift. Unfortunately, some people use the Bible to say the same thing. For it is by grace you have been saved, Ephesians 2 verse 8, through faith. And this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God. And now in Ephesians 2 verse 8, there's the verse that says, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God. This is the New International Version. Now, I know that the New Living Translation is not necessarily a translation. It is more of an interpretation, but I think it's clearer to show what the verse actually means. God saved you by His grace when you believed, and you can't take credit for this. It is a gift from God. So in actual fact, Ephesians 2 verse 8, when it speaks about the gift aspect, is not referring to faith. It's referring to grace. Grace is the gift. In the Bible, yes, it is true that there are passages where even Paul in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 12 verse 9, speaks about faith as a spiritual gift, but that's within the context of service and ministry. It's not the saving, you know, that thing by which we position ourselves in a relationship with God. But it is that which we exercise in our ministry, in our service. Faith, I would suggest to you, is not a gift. And we will see what I mean by that. Question number 3 is faith a choice? Okay, so the first one, is faith rational? Is faith a gift that only some people can have? How unfair that would be, you know, on the day of judgment, if God were to judge people on the basis of them accepting Him or rejecting Him, if He were not to impart the gift of faith, the ability to believe to all. That wouldn't be fair. So let me share with you, question number 3, is faith a choice? Let me share with you a tale of two brothers. And this is the story of two brothers who grew up in a relatively normal home, but they didn't really get along, they say. They both confessed. At about the age of 15, in their teens, they went through the rebellious phase. They burned the Bible, and they decided, you know what, we're not going to believe in God anymore. It's just a story. Now, this, one of them tells the story, and he says this was also accentuated by the fact that their mother had an affair with a lay clergyman. And then there was also in the home this painting that tormented them concerning the Last Judgment. Both of them ended up as journalists in Russia, and they witnessed the evil of communism. But interestingly enough, one of them decided to become a Christian, a believer, and the other didn't. And this is the story of Christopher and Peter Hitchens. All right, Christopher Hitchens, I've made reference to him a number of times, and Peter Hitchens. And Peter Hitchens is a journalist. He writes quite a bit in English newspapers. And he wrote a book entitled The Rage Against God, How Atheism Led Me to Faith. And in that book he says, as Christopher became more certain about the non-existence of God, I have become more certain that we cannot know such a thing in the way that we know anything else, and so must choose whether to believe in God or not. So he had a very interesting journey to faith, but then, you know, he said, I came to a point where I had to make a choice. Now, I'm really sorry that I can't share my screen, because I would have liked you to see this information. And probably what I can do, Pastor Trevor, Pastor Thomas, I can send you the PDF format of the presentation. Now, I remind you that this will one day, probably within the next 2 to 3 months, by the end of the year or maybe January, will be in a docuseries format, but I don't mind you having the presentation. And now, trying to answer these 3 questions, I'm going to take you very briefly and very quickly, because we don't have the time, through a journey of psychological research on faith. Okay? And I'm going to start with Canadian-born British experimental psychologist Bruce Hood. And he specializes in developmental cognitive neuroscience. And he, as a result of his studies, and again, now I don't have time to give all the details, but you can always make, you know, use of the names, Google them, read their books. He said humans actually are not rational creatures. And this innate irrationality leads to religion and superstition. Hood suggests that the supernatural beliefs, or this ability to believe in the supernatural, is hardwired in our brains from birth, and that religions are therefore tapping into a powerful psychological force. All the people that I'm going to be referring to now, all the scientists, are not Christians. Some of them are evolutionary psychologists. They've done extensive studies trying to figure out where does this phenomenon, natural phenomenon called faith comes from. Where does it come from? And what Hood is saying is that from birth, it is hardwired into our brains. Then we come to Jesse Bering. He is an evolutionary psychologist. He wrote the book, The Belief Instinct. And he says that the religious reflex, he calls it a reflex, religious reflex, is not an irrational aberration. God is not a cultural invention or an existential band-aid, but an intrinsic human trait. Remember how I began. And please remember what I said at the start. This presentation is meant to be a door opener on the question of God many people dismiss the idea of God's existence by saying that talking about faith and exercising faith and all this faith stuff is completely irrelevant. It's a cop-out. That's what Richard Dawkins said. You know, it's been called different things. And we can do without. Is it? Well, science seems to say that it's something that we are burdened with. Kevin Nelson is a professor of neurology at the University of Kentucky. And in his book, The God Impulse, Is Religion Hardwired into the Brain? He says faith is an impulse, right? Baring calls it reflex. He calls it impulse. And spiritual experience is an incidental product of several different neurological processes acting independently. And then maybe you've heard of Andrew Newberg. Andrew Newberg is probably one of the best known people in this field. And he wrote a book called Why God Won't Go Away. He's a neuroscientist. He's the director of research of integrative medicine at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital. He's also a professor of religious studies. And he's done brain imaging of Buddhist monks while meditating, nuns praying, even Pentecostal Christians speaking in tongues. So he's done, while they were busy with that, he's done brain imaging. And he came to the following conclusions. The religious impulse is rooted in the biology of the human brain. Religion is not merely a product of biology or a neurological illusion. The concept of God is hardwired in our brain. So those who say that God is a human construct, what do they mean by that? Because the idea of God is as natural to us as it is to breathe the air that surrounds us. It's hardwired into our brain, into our being. Lawrence Krauss, one of Richard Dawkins' best buddies, they actually did a movie called Unbelievers. He went to different campuses and, you know, had conversations and interviewed people and all that. He said, this is a debate he had on the issue of faith and science, and he said, we are wired to believe and need to fight against it as scientists. In order to be objective, we need to fight against this propensity to believe and to worship. In closing, I think the only conclusion and evidence and facts that we can give on faith is that faith is persistent, innate, unavoidable, ineradicable, inherent, and natural to humans. Faith is. There's nothing shameful about exploring this beautiful concept, this beautiful propensity that we have to believe. We can choose where to place or misplace our faith, but to believe is as natural to us as anything else that makes us who we are, human beings. And I would like to suggest to you that this is probably a good starting point in any conversation with people who may be somehow, I don't know, intimidated by the idea or put off by the idea of, you know, the question of, is there a God? By helping people acknowledge that faith is something we need to face. It is a burden we have to carry. And because I'm speaking to, I assume, mainly believers, I want to end with the story of Jonah. Jonah fought against that which God gifted him, all right? A ministry of grace. He fought against it. God told him, go here. He went the opposite way. And what did he experience? Restlessness. And sometimes when I'm in a context such as this, and especially where there are people who are not really sure where they stand on the whole faith issue. I pray, and I tell them from the start, in my prayer, I'm going to pray to God to give you that the restlessness until you make peace with the idea that faith is something that you should explore. That faith is something that you should give it, you need to look into it and give God a chance. Because I believe that probably the greatest need of our humanity today is peace. And peace comes, I believe, when after we've been challenged by God, we give in to Him and begin the journey with a God who knows, a God who cares, and a God who is able. Amen.